I'm Mark Golub, and in the news, the Jewish community continues to be concerned with the implications of an anticipated indictment of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu on criminal corruption charges. Now, we continue to stress this fact on JBS. There is actually no indictment at the present time. But Israel's highly respected Attorney General, Avichai Mandelblit, has said he has every intention of indicting Mr. Netanyahu on charges of bribery, fraud, and breach of trust. Of course, this news has rocked the state of Israel, which is preparing now for national elections on April 9th. Will Mr. Netanyahu withdraw from the elections, which most observers believe is highly unlikely? Assuming he continues his campaign for a fifth term as prime minister, does he have any chance of winning and of being in a position to create the next coalition government? And what does this legal scandal do to the other political fortunes of other candidates and parties, most notably the new Blue and White Party led by former General Chief of Staff Benny Gantz and Yair Lapid, the creator of the failed Yesh Atid party? Blue and White seems to have the best chances of winning the most seats in the April elections, as they also have two other former chiefs of staff, Moshe Ya'alon and Gabi Ashkenazi. So how is this playing out in Israel? What are Israelis saying? Do they care about the possible indictment of Mr. Netanyahu? And is there another political figure who can win the confidence and trust of the Israeli people? For some answers, we're joined, as always, from Israel by the outstanding political correspondent and analyst for the online newspaper The Times of Israel, Haviv Rettig Gur. Haviv, thank you so much for joining us again.
Hi, Mark. Thanks for having me.
So, Haviv, you heard my summary of the political winds swirling around the state of Israel. Do you want to add anything to my description?
I think that's the gist of things. We did see Netanyahu sort of begin a new campaign after Thursday when the indictment intention was announced. A campaign that says, the prosecutors are out to get me, the police is out to get me, it's all politicized, none of it is serious, and vote for me anyway. Vote for me as an expression of opposition to the whole idea that, these prosecutors can decide the election. And we could now have a campaign slogan out that says, don't let them, the prosecutors decide the election. You should decide the election. So it's really become the center of the campaign itself at this point.
Let's break down the issues one by one. First, how do you think Israelis view Attorney General Mandelblit's motives? Is there any concern that his indictments are politically motivated, as many Americans feel the investigation into Donald Trump here in America is a case of partisan politics? What about Israelis?
It's awfully hard to make that case about Mandelblit. Mandelblit is thought to be a right-wing religious man. He's a confidant of Netanyahu. Once upon a time, he was Netanyahu's cabinet secretary. He ran the government for Netanyahu. And that's a political appointment by Netanyahu. And then Netanyahu actually pushed him for attorney general. This would be as if Jeff Sessions were to launch a corruption investigation into Donald Trump. That would be the political equivalent of what's happening. So it's awfully hard to make it, and Netanyahu is now trying. That, as I said, has become his main argument now. This is political. But he has a much harder time than Donald Trump has when there's a great deal of tension and opposition within government to the Trump administration. Yes. That's not true in Israel.
Yes.
And in fact, the man who makes the decision on the indictment is a Netanyahu man for many years.
And by the way, what could be Mandelblit's motives politically if they were political? One of the things that seems to me is it's hard to say they were political because I can't find any political motive for Mandelblit. Is there a motive I'm not aware of?
No, I don't think anyone is arguing that there is. Netanyahu hasn't argued that either. What we've seen that's interesting is the Likud campaign try to pull a little bit of a rabbit out of its hat. What it's arguing now is that there are prosecutors under Mandelblit, the state attorney, Shai Nitzan, Liat Ben-Ari, who is the economic and financial crimes division head in the Tel Aviv prosecution office, which is she's the actual lawyer in the state prosecution, actually conducting the trial, the prosecution, the indictment, whatever actually comes to happen. She's the attorney in the courtroom actually doing it. And what Netanyahu has argued is that Liat Ben-Ari and Shai Nitzan pressured Mandelblit, and left-wing campaigners pressured Mandelblit, and he literally gave a speech on Thursday after the announcement of the indictment intention, in which he said, Mandelblit is only human. There's only so much pressure the man can take before he does something that he doesn't believe in, obviously. Right? So Netanyahu is trying to figure out a way to thread the needle, to say Mandelblit himself isn't doing it. Mandelblit, of course, is the one making the decision. Mandelblit is the one announcing the decision. Mandelblit wrote the 75-page opinion informing Netanyahu's lawyers on Thursday that he intends to indict him in 3 corruption cases. But he's only doing it because of this emotional, psychological, peer pressure, etc.
Okay.
Again, it's a harder argument to make, but even Netanyahu is not arguing that Mandelblit himself has a political reason.
My sense is that is not resonating with the Israeli public.
It is not. I have not heard anyone suggesting seriously that Mandelblit himself is himself corrupted, and that's how these corruption indictments are coming. Also, it's important to note that in a lot of these cases, a great deal of the facts are not in dispute. Netanyahu received hundreds of thousands of shekels worth of gifts from billionaire friends. This is called one of the 3 cases. It's called Case 1000. And he admits receiving these gifts. And he just says this should not be illegal. There's nothing morally or ethically wrong with it. Receiving significant value gifts as a sitting prime minister from people in Israel, from people who have economic interests in Israel. Arnon Milchin, the Hollywood producer, owns a piece of a television station in Israel, and Netanyahu, who is also communications minister, was the regulator of the television network. He was the main state regulator for that industry. So there's these connections that are conflict of interest connections, but Netanyahu says, look, life is complicated, and these kinds of gifts, it's not illegal to get gifts from friends. So when you have a situation where, again, unlike with the Trump story, the facts are not so much in dispute.
Yes.
There isn't really a dispute about the Netanyahu, asking the Walla website, news website, which probably your viewers don't know so much because it only publishes in Hebrew, for better coverage. They pressured this website for better coverage, but then Netanyahu says, I'm a politician, I have spokespeople. Their job is to call journalists and push my way of looking at things, right? So what part of this relationship is illegal? So the argument is not over the facts. And I think that's where the real substantive debate is going on. What is bribery? Is a billionaire who owns a media outlet telling a politician, I'll cover you properly, I'll cover you favorably if you do the policies that I want. Is that a bribe? Is that just politics? What is that?
Mm-hmm. You define it so well. In fact, here in America, I don't hear that issue defined well. And, Netanyahu does have a long list of answers to all of the charges against him. Now, they may hold up, they may not hold up. But it's not like he hasn't said exactly what you've said. I did it, and Netanyahu basically says, what I did, people knew about. My lawyer told me it was okay. I took gifts of champagne and cigars from a guy who was swimming in both and is rich, and he gave me a present. What's the big deal? He claims that whatever decisions he made while he was a minister, he did with his entire committee's approval. He didn't go behind their back. He didn't do something surreptitious. So from Netanyahu's point of view, he is saying what you're saying he is saying. It's important for, again, people who are watching JBS to understand that life is never simple. And so what we have here is potential charges, actually charges which may lead to an indictment of a sitting prime minister, but the prime minister has answers which he feels are legitimate, and that's going to have to be worked out not only in court, Haviv, but also in the court of public opinion. And that was my next question for you. How do you feel, how do you think Israelis feel right now about Benjamin Netanyahu? We've talked about this before, but how do you think they feel about him right now, both the man on the one hand and the prime minister on the other?
I tell you, my sense is there's a sense of real betrayal. First of all, his opponents are already sort of emotionally primed to feel betrayed, right? Because they dislike him anyway.
Right.
But I think his supporters, you know, he has so much going for him. He led the opposition to the Iran deal at a time where even in Israel, just about everyone in Israel in the sort of policy planning elite opposed the Obama-Iran deal, but many said, look, it's a done deal. We're not going to change the mind of a president. Let's at least negotiate for ourselves some protections, some quid pro quos. We'll be okay with the deal. Obama will give us more, whatever, defense budget, whatever. You know, let's make our peace with the Iran deal and see what we can get out of it. And Netanyahu was the head of a small group that said, no, we oppose it. We oppose it permanently and constantly and persistently. We can still derail this thing, even after it was signed, even after it was done, you know, in 2016, and it's already a done deal for a year. He still thinks he can derail it. And it turned out, because Trump won and because of other things, because of problems happening in Tehran and for other reasons, that he was right. And he is seen as someone who was right on Iran. He is seen by many Israelis as someone who holds the line in Gaza, has been a good steward of the Israeli economy. There's so many successes, achievements that this man can point to. And people who support him want to be able to just support him and celebrate him and enjoy the fact that they have this man who keeps winning elections and also delivers, they feel, on the policies, right? Free market policies, hawkish foreign policy. People like him very much on policy. And they, I think, feel really profoundly betrayed because these are corruption cases that are remarkable in their pettiness. You're a sitting prime minister, you personally, Mark, right? You're a rabbi, so maybe this doesn't apply. But just ethically, right? Your ethical standards are higher than a politician's. But imagine yourself as prime minister. Uh-huh. You're running a country. You have this tremendous weight on your shoulders. A country in constant war, constantly doing grand strategy, constantly worrying about these things. A small economy, very dependent on exports. An economy that has to be carefully managed, much more than the United States, which even when it fails is still the major world economy. Don't accept hundreds of thousands of shekels or dollars worth of gifts from billionaires as a sitting... You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. There's something petty about it. Also, Netanyahu is himself a multimillionaire. He's a wealthy man. So these scandals they tarnish him very deeply. And they tarnish him in ways that we might not see at the ballot box because a lot of his voters are saying now, look, he's a little bit of a petty, he didn't just receive gifts from these billionaires. He actively solicited them. He had his people go to their people and ask them for more champagne bottles in boxes of champagne bottles. And these are extremely expensive champagne. There was something very petty and hedonistic and narcissistic about the whole thing. And that's if you don't assume that there's corruption there. And I think I think in the public opinion, people will still vote for him. Many of his supporters, I would say the vast majority of his supporters, will still vote for him because they don't really care that much about those issues. They really care about Iran and the economy and things like that. But I think something deep about his legacy has been a little bit corrupted by him.
And yet you just said, as disappointed as his supporters may be, you expect them to vote for him again.
We have a lot on the line in this country.
Yes.
What kind of prime minister he is matters more than what kind of man he is.
Okay. So, I asked you a moment ago, separate for me how Israelis feel about the man as opposed to the prime minister. And you've said this to me in some ways before. There are a lot of people who have never been comfortable with who Netanyahu is as a person, but they've seen no one on the political landscape in Israel right now whom they would rather have lead the country. And it sounds to me like even now, despite the potential charges and indictments against him, you're saying something similar still exists. That people still are going to vote for Netanyahu, and they're going to sort of hold their nose as they do.
Yes. Having said that, I should say that the Blue and White Party campaign, the Benny Gantz campaign, is running an entire campaign that essentially has argued Benny Gantz can do everything Netanyahu can do, agrees with all the things that Netanyahu, has promised, will deliver on all the things Netanyahu will deliver without the bad stuff, without the rhetoric of incitement. Netanyahu has this whole campaign now. Benny Gantz will sit with Arabs. Don't think about you should be worried about the Arabs. You should be concerned about. He's constantly talking about Arabs. The campaign is constantly. Literally today, his campaign said the election is between Tibi, which is the Arab lawmaker Ahmed Tibi, or Bibi. And why is it between Tibi or Bibi? Because if Benny Gantz is to be prime minister, he'll need the okay vote to be prime minister in the parliament of Ahmed Tibi. Now, I think he's wrong on the math. I think that if Benny Gantz really does have a much larger party, then the ultra-Orthodox will vote with him. A lot of people will become the Kachlon Kulanu party will vote with him. I think that if Gantz has a larger party after Election Day than Netanyahu by a significant margin, by more than 1 or 2 seats, a whole lot of Israeli political parties that have sided with Netanyahu for many years will turn out to be very flexible. So I think that is, on the substance, I think, wrong. But what's interesting is that Likud was running a campaign that is trying to be racist. It's trying to scare people into thinking that Arabs will be part of a coalition and that the Arabs who will be part of a coalition are evil people. So they're trying to create this. It's not a campaign against some terror-supporting, crazy radical. It's a campaign against a very mainstream Arab politician, and trying to argue that Gantz is TV. So part of Gantz's campaign has been, Netanyahu, you stay in power by inciting us, by dividing us. You stay in power by scaring everybody. That's the Gantz campaign, which is a very wise campaign, and I think it's made a real dent. We see now, in the last 3-4 days since the indictment announcement, for the very first time in 10 years that Netanyahu has been as prime minister, someone other than Netanyahu is the most favored individual for prime minister in the polling. And that is brand new. It's lasted 3 days now, which means, of course, it could fade away tomorrow, or it could last until Election Day and Gantz could be prime minister. But that's new. And I think Netanyahu, the chickens are starting to come home to roost on all these personal issues. At some point, personal issues matter. I think certainly Trump is realizing that, or should realize that. At some point, the personal failings really do come home politically and matter.
But it is a fascinating time politically in Israel. Well, it's a fascinating time here in America. But at the moment, my focus and our focus is on Israel, and it's just fascinating. Now, I've had people tell me 2 things. That the Blue and White Party's platform is, don't vote for Netanyahu. He's no good. But that they have no larger platform, and that in the end, Israelis are going to want to know if beyond the Palestinians and beyond not being Netanyahu, what are you for? And the other thing that I've heard is that Blue and White could actually win more seats in the upcoming elections, but that they would have a harder time putting a coalition of 61 or more seats together than Netanyahu would, even if Netanyahu came in second. Speak to those 2 issues, please.
First of all, the second one is easy, so I'll just get that out of the way first. That is absolutely true. You need a parliamentary majority of 61 seats in Israel's 120-seat parliament to have the coalition government, to rule the country, to be prime minister. And no party in Israel's history has ever had 61 seats in parliament. So it's always been a coalition of multiple parties. and the easier coalition is usually the one that succeeds. We had this in, I believe it was the race between Livni and Netanyahu. Livni, as the head of Kadima, got one seat more than Likud under Netanyahu. And even though Tzipi Livni led the larger faction, the other parties, more parties other than Likud and Kadima, wanted Netanyahu as prime minister, and they all recommended to the president to appoint Netanyahu, to give Netanyahu the first shot at forming a coalition, and the president got a majority of votes to ask Netanyahu to do it, and he asked Netanyahu cobbled together his coalition and became prime minister, even though he led the second largest party in the parliament. So it's already happened. It's already happened to Netanyahu. It's easier to do when there's a 1-seat gap than when there's, for example, a 6-seat gap. Now, we had a poll. This is one single poll. It should not be, paid too much attention to, except that it hasn't happened before. It's a poll that from a respectable polling company that gave Gantz 38 seats and Netanyahu 30. Now, an 8-seat gap, and I think it's an outlier, and I don't think that's what the result will be, but an 8-seat gap, when you ask even just 1,000 Israelis that happen to poll, is a brand new phenomenon, and if it is an 8-seat gap on election day, there's just no chance. There's no precedent, there's no reason that the president would ask Netanyahu to try. And once Gantz has first shot at doing it, he has to essentially give everybody else what they want in the coalition agreements, and he can sit. Listen, we've had coalition governments with Labor and Jewish Home on the left and on the far right together in a coalition under Netanyahu. Under Netanyahu. So it's all happened before, and it's absolutely true. The first point was an interesting one. People saying, what is blue and white for? What does it stand for? And here, I think that we tend to turn a blind eye, a very sympathetic blind eye toward people we sort of intuitively like and understand and feel connected to in politics. What is Likud for? What does the Likud party today stand for in the sense of what is it running on? Does the Likud party today support a Palestinian state, like Prime Minister Netanyahu officially declared in a big policy speech in 2009 and repeated several times in major interviews to foreign media outlets? Or does the Likud party not support a Palestinian state, like the Likud Central Committee said in a big vote a couple of years ago, and like a lot of Likud politicians insist all the time? So what does Likud support or not support? Is Likud willing to negotiate major territorial withdrawals in the West Bank, as Netanyahu did in 2014 in the Kerry talks? Or is the Likud not willing to do that, as Netanyahu claims in the current election campaign? Blue and white is for exactly what Likud is for. Mm-hmm. These are two parties that both agree on the Gaza policy. They both agree on the Iran policy. They both agree on the economic policy. Broadly speaking, there are very slight differences. Netanyahu is a free market man, but he hasn't dismantled the Israeli welfare state. Mm-hmm. Israel has a wonderful universal health care. He's not about to dismantle it. He doesn't believe in dismantling it. On a lot of domestic issues, Benjamin Netanyahu is a lot closer to Bernie Sanders than to Republicans. And that's not a statement about Netanyahu not being right-wing. In Israeli terms, he's a conservative, but Israeli terms are very different from American terms. So to argue that blue and white doesn't stand for much, but Likud somehow does, I think is a hard argument to make. A lot of Israeli political campaigns have lost their substance, have lost the ability to really have a substantive policy debate, which is one reason everybody's sort of screaming and shouting, because we don't really have differences of opinion anymore. There's very little actual policy separating Netanyahu and Gantz.
So,
in my view,
I understand. I love hearing your opinion. We only have a couple minutes left, and so I'm going to ask you questions. You really have to be very to the point. There was the issue about Otzma Yehudit, Netanyahu reaching out to a far-right party that is the inheritor of the philosophy of Meir Kahana's Kach party. And here in America, he got slammed for it, again, for in any way being involved with a racist party, which is what Kach was ultimately convicted, not the right word, but the Israeli Supreme Court denied Koch's right to run in elections on the grounds that it was racist. Here in America, you have AIPAC, you have American Jewish Committee, coming out publicly against Netanyahu's reaching out to Otzma Yehudit. And my question for you is not about Netanyahu. Very quickly, you are the political analyst for the Times of Israel. What's it mean to you that AIPAC and American Jewish Committee have taken positions they normally never take? Namely, they never get involved with specific issues that affect the Israeli electorate. They say, we support the democratic process of the Israeli people. It's not our business to make comments about specific policies. Both AIPAC and the American Jewish Committee here have gone on record criticizing Netanyahu. We only have 60 seconds. What's it mean to you as a political analyst?
I understand where they're coming from. They don't just, let the Israelis do whatever they want. AIPAC and American Jewish Committee base their activism and their advocacy on the assumption and on the claim that Israel meets the moral standards that they dream about and they yearn for, and how they think of Israel and feel Israel. These guys, these Kahanists, do not meet that standard. It's important to grasp they're not just openly racist. These are people who have proposed legislation in the Knesset to outlaw sexual relations between ethnicities. And they were compared when Kahana proposed this in the 80s, Likud walked out on him, and he was compared by a Likud lawmaker to the Nuremberg laws, because part of the Nazis' Nuremberg laws was forbidding sexual relations. They literally forbid dating. They would like to outlaw dating between Jews and Arabs. Now, I happen to hope my kids marry Jewish and all of that, and I'm the rabbi's son, and I married a rabbi's daughter, but the idea that you could legally outlaw, that means you would have police enforcing these things, checking on people, whether it's a prosecutable offense. These are genuinely awful people. And I can go on. I never take political opinions. I'm taking one. This is beyond the bounds. This is the end of this whole game of democracy. That's who these people are, openly, publicly. They talk about it, they announce it, they're proud of it. One of the people on the number 4 on the Otzma Yehudit list is a man who runs an organization that has protests, loud and sometimes violent protests, outside interfaith weddings. Private people marry each other, and if one is Jewish and one is not, there are violent protesters outside from this organization. And there's charges being brought against him for things including terrorism. They defend Jewish terrorists who murder Palestinians, and they openly defend them. So this is not Israel. And when Netanyahu thinks that this is a part of the political game, I think for many Israelis he broke a lot of... and his response, by the way, he had to deliver a speech defending himself in Hebrew to Israelis, and his response was, you leftists will sit with Arabs. How can you talk to me about, right? Which is, again, this kind of, So it is a red line. And I think that the vast majority of Israelis are on AIPAC. I mean, every Israeli I've ever heard of, Naftali Bennett of the Jewish Home Party, which is farther right than Likud, is horrified and ashamed and said these people have no place in the Knesset. And so that's my answer. I share their concern, absolutely 100%. And Netanyahu shares their concern. When he's not campaigning, this is something that would horrify him. If the left did this, this would be the only thing he talked about for a year.
Mm-hmm. Haviv, you are wonderful.
And now I go back to being a journalist.
You're the best journalist there is. It is always a delight to speak to you. You give us perspective that we get nowhere else. You continue the fabulous work you're doing. Kol tuv v'hatzlacha. We will speak often, my friend. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you so much.
We're out of time. My thanks to our director, Sloan Copeland, JBS's Associate Director, Dara Golub, Editor, John McDevitt, and to the producer of In the News, Carol Lilienthal. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. Be well, my friends.